exactly 3 native mammals. They're all bats. And so the introduction of weasels, ferrets, rabbits, possums to New Zealand over the last couple of hundred years by particularly Europeans, but not all of them. Shipwrecks, for example, came with native Maoris, has really decimated the local wildlife, right? And so the New Zealand government is shoving huge amounts of money into trying to figure out how to remove invasive mammals, particularly predators, from New Zealand. A more close to home example for me of invasive species and the damage they're doing comes from this place. This is the Murray-Darling Basin in New South Wales, Australia. The Murray-Darling is the source of a significant amount of the water that drives Australian agriculture. It's one of the most biodiverse places in the world, or at least it used to be. So it is currently teeming with European carp. European carp were introduced in the
Did you really look very hard to find a picture of making them look so ugly and unattractive?
Yes. I'm not above using emotions to manipulate people in this talk. I'll be showing you some scary pictures of European rabbits later on. The carp were introduced in the 1920s. The population exploded in the 60s and 70s in Australia. They're now the dominant species in the basin, to the point where there are places where they make up 90% of the fish biomass, and you can find 1 per square meter. Because of the way that carp feed and interact with the environment, they do huge amounts of damage, not just by outcompeting species, but by doing things like they tear up the bottom. So they create this muddy water you see here, is largely due to carp feeding. It undermines the banks. And so the banks start collapsing inwards. The lack of light kills off local plants. And on top of that, you can't really fish them. They're not good for eating. There really aren't any commercial purposes for European carp, and so they're just sort of sitting in there. Some people fish them, they're not ideal. The Australian government has put about $16 million into trying to control invasive carp over the last couple of years. But their range is still expanding. They're long-lived species. They last more than 40 years in the wild. So even if you could stop them breeding today, right, we still have decades worth of European carp there. And they have high mobility. They're really good at moving from place to place. They spread very quickly. If you remove them from one area, they just repopulate. Okay, so we're really worried about invasive species. They do a lot of damage, but fortunately we have some techniques on the table to try and control them. Here are 6 that currently people talk about. I'm only going to talk about 2 today. I'm going to talk about hunting at the top here and poisons, but we also include things like sterile male release. We have things that what people tend to term the nuclear reaction, just wipe out everything in an environment and restart. At the top, I'll talk a little later about 1080 and like poisoning as a way of getting rid of things. And then people have actually used explosives to try and get rid of invasive fish. Never a great idea, but it turns out sometimes it works. All right, so I'm going to talk about these 2 briefly. I don't have time to go into like depth of everything, here's why the hunting and diseases aren't ideal solutions. Hunting can be great in some specific circumstances. So for example, there were invasive species of goats on a place called Isabella Island. They wanted to get rid of them. What did they do? They hired a bunch of military snipers on helicopters. They flew around the place and just killed every goat they saw. Turned out that worked, right? So large species and small spaces, it turns out that hunting can sometimes help. But by and large, eliminating every member of an invasive species via hunting is really hard. You can do a lot of good just removing the environment, but you can't remove everything, and so they just bounce back the moment that you stop. Populations quickly rebound. I'm not sure why my screen is not. That's fine. Populations quickly rebound if you stop. On top of that, you have things like stories like this little guy. There's a really well-known story in invasive species control and hunting about a poor grad student who wanted to study invasive species on the remote islands and how they spread. So what did they do? They took a bunch of rats, shoved some trackers on them, and just got government permission to release them on an island, right? and they watched how they spread. And at the end of 3 months, they went and picked up all the rats except for one. And this poor grad student spent 1.5 years trying to find the last rat on the island. The rat not only jumped islands several times, but like even with a tracker, they couldn't physically get the last rat. They have a really good paper out in Nature actually about this called Getting or Catching the Last Rat on the Island, all about why hunting just isn't effective. You just cannot physically remove them via hunting in most of these cases. One way people are talking about getting rid of invasive species is diseases, right? Well, this is another dominant way to do it. In the invasive carp case in Australia, they're actually talking about releasing a form of herpes into the environment during breeding season. You're going to kill off all the fish during breeding. This has a number of big problems. One is that the sheer amount of dead fish in the environment is going to cause huge amounts of damage. On top of that, most widely used diseases don't work if you've got a big enough range. So take, for example, myxomatosis. Myxomatosis is used to target rabbits. It's been released in New Zealand, across Australia, in my home state of Tasmania. But it turns out if you release the disease, unless it immediately crashes the population, as with small islands, they just bounce back in the old community, right? So there are a bunch of studies on rabbits in Australia that showed that while myxomatosis had a 90% mortality rate in the first couple of years, 5 years down the line, it only had a 25% mortality rate. They rapidly evolve resistances to these things. And on top of that, diseases and as well poisons I've not really talked about here, but they're really harsh. They do a lot of damage to the target species. It can take them weeks or months to die from these diseases or poisons. We're talking like internal hemorrhaging, blindness, right? Like it's just really cruel to the target species to use these techniques. It also adds a lot of risk to the local environment, right? Something eats a dead rabbit that died of myxomatosis and gets sick itself. Quolls in Australia are a good example of this. They're killing off native quolls because they eat dead rabbit. There have been cases where it seems like pets and even children have been exposed to poisons that are in the environment. And so like, basically what I'm saying is that all these techniques have serious drawbacks. It's not to say they don't work in certain circumstances, but by and large, it's just the case that no one of these is good enough to get rid of invasive species as it stands. No one of these will deal with rabbits in New Zealand, invasive carp in Australia, lionfish in Florida, pick your favorite invasive species, house sparrows in North America, right? And so we're looking for a new way of dealing with things. And this is where genetic modification enters the narrative. So gene drives have been called the silver bullet for invasive species. In particular, scientists are using genetic modification based on CRISPR-Cas9 technology to develop gene drives, and a particular type of them called a suppression drive. So suppression drives are, well, let me start with what gene drives are. So I'm not going to give a full detail here, but here's the rough way a gene drive works. When you have two members of the species that breed, sometimes they have dominant genes, sometimes they have recessive genes, there's children or a mix of both of them, right? A gene drive forces itself to be the dominant thing in the child, right? So this individual here has been gene driven. That means that both of its offspring are guaranteed to have the gene drive as part of its genetics, right? And because each of them have it, you guarantee that all of their offspring also have the gene. Right, so it's a drive, it drives through the population, right, sort of a cascade effect. Okay, so what you do is take a gene, attach it to a gene drive, and just make sure that every subsequent generation has the gene. Well, so how do you use it to get rid of species? You do something like make maleness the thing they're inheriting, right? So there's something called daughterless drives. What you do is you just make it the case that anything that has this gene is male. And then over time, you reduce the number of females and you guarantee that any males they find have the drive. And so all the females' offspring are male. And over time, the population crashes. Okay. Now, it's worth noting that none of these are currently viable for release. Well, this is theoretical. No one is like actively releasing these days. But this is like very actively what people are working on building, right? To deal with carp in Australia, and we're using them for rabbits and so forth in New Zealand. Okay. So What I'm going to call suppression drives, which is a gene drive that has this like property of suppressing population, has a lot of really great benefits, right? For one, it's kind of the surrounding environment. It's very targeted. You're not going to accidentally poison children and pets. You're not worried about diseases running rampant and killing things left, right, and center. The species themselves live happy, long, healthy lives and die off naturally. They have offspring. It's just the case they slowly breed themselves out of existence. Suppression drives are also better at reducing the numbers of the target population, especially over broad areas. You can exploit natural migration patterns and breeding patterns. So it can reach areas that traditional techniques can't, right? And because it doesn't kill the host like diseases or poisons, it has a much more effective transmission rate. Theoretically, you can just release a handful of the gene-driven individuals into the environment and just it'll spread by itself. You don't have to do anything else. So gene drives and suppression drives could potentially solve the problem of invasive species, right? This is why they've been called the silver bullet. It does, however, also have the potential to do serious damage. So there are three risks that dominate I'm not sure there we go. So there are three risks that like dominate the literature. One is off-target effects. So that's, look, I'm introducing a gene into an individual. What happens if the gene mutates in unexpected ways or interacts in kind of unexpected ways with the individual's genetics? People talk about like frankenfish and frankenanimals we might build. Another is migration. The gene might move into a species you don't want it to be in. Either by something called hybridization, right? Like a species might be able to breed with another one of slightly different species. They could have viable offspring that can themselves have children. It can act as a bridge between species. Or something called horizontal gene transfer. So this is very unlikely, but it is possible. Certain bacteria will cut pieces of genetics out, and when they move to a new species, they'll drop the gene into the species. And our chances are like actually pulling the entire gene drive out and dropping it exactly where it needs to be in another species is low, but it is a possibility. And the one I'm going to focus on today is escape, right? What happens when a gene drive gets out of its quarantine? And it starts affecting every individual of the target species. All right, so the question I want to ask today is basically this one. Under what circumstances are we warranted in using a remote but higher risk environmental technology, right? So I'm interested in questions like, given that these risks exist, but given the potential benefits of the technology, like when are we allowed to use it? And what species are we allowed to use it on? So these risks are the reason that we've seen things like proposed moratoriums on gene drives and suppression drives in particular. So this was signed by hundreds of scientists and politicians, trying to sort of say that, look, we shouldn't be pursuing this technology, we definitely should be releasing it. And in this context, we often refer to something called the precautionary principle. So this is like a paradigmatic phrasing of the precautionary principle. But it basically says, when an activity raises threat of harm to human health or the environment, precautionary measures should be taken, even if some cause and effect relationship is not fully established scientifically. So we just don't know how likely these risks are, how to mitigate them necessarily. We're uncertain what potential damages could happen to this technology releasing it. The precautionary principle says something like, look, like if you don't know, don't do it, right? Be careful, be precautious in the kinds of things that you're going to do. Okay, so three big risks that we're worried about. These two are things that scientists are actively trying to solve, right? The biologists I talk to, the geneticists I talk to, like they know these risks exist, and anything that gets released, they're going to do their best to minimize these possible worries, right? You're never going to release a drive in something that can hybridize, for example. And they're trying to be very careful when they build these drives so they can remove as many off-target effects. Like, you know, they're aware of these problems and they're really working to solve them. I'm going to talk about the third one today, which is something that no one's really talking about this way. The scientists are aware of it, but in particular, it's unique to suppression drives, right? Gene drives in general, like, have these two risks. This one only exists for suppression drives, right? You're really worried about escape if you have a thing that could drive it to extinction, right? Okay, so I think there's something really unique about this, and I think I got something that looks a bit like an answer from what circumstances are allowed to use this technology. So, let's talk about the risk of escape. So, it's difficult to assess the chances of a gene drive escape in quarantine, right? If I want to use this gene drive on, say, rabbits in New Zealand, like how do I figure out whether this gene drive is going to get back to native ranges for rabbits in Europe, right? That's an important question if I want to like justify releasing this drive.
Unless you want to kill them all.
Unless you want to kill them all, which is where we're going with this.
Yeah.
All right. So there are two factors to this. One, what's the chance of escaping quarantine? And two, given an escape quarantine, is it going to kill everything? So let's start with the first one, risk of escape. So there are two fundamentally competing requirements to the technology, right? On the one hand, it needs to be really good at driving through a population. The better it is at spreading, the more effective it is at removing its target species. On the other hand, it needs to be containable. You don't want to spread through every individual species globally, right? So this is why when we talk about gene drives, we often talk about isolation, right? We're going to release them on islands, on like species that are not mobile. You want a way of like containing the drive until the species goes out of existence, and then you can like lift your quarantine. The problem is that biocontrol containment has a very fraught history. We're not good at containing animals, it turns out, for better and worse reasons. So one serious factor in this is that when we talk about using gene drives, it's often on the most invasive species, right? But ship rats are called ship rats for a reason, right? They're highly mobile, they like get everywhere. Humans just accidentally move things all the time. Think of like mussels on ships, sea stars, green crabs. Insects get moved back and forth. In California, you have to inspect every plant that goes in and out, including dead wood, because they're worried about certain types of insects moving from one side of the continent to the other. People will just bring exotic pets to places, and those will escape, right? So like, it's hard to control and contain these species sometimes. Humans are also not the only way in which species can spread. So there's been some talk about using gene drives on lampreys in the Mauritian Great Lakes in America. The problem is that lampreys are native to the ocean, the Atlantic. And while they can't move upstream to get to the Great Lakes, we introduce them to the Great Lakes. Once in the Great Lakes, there's a chance they'll move downstream back to native populations, right? And so you wouldn't be able to do something like release a gene drive there because you can't guarantee you can control it. On top of that, humans aren't great at this. Humans are, there's a long history of humans doing really stupid things when it comes to biocontrol. Here are, what should be, I think, 4 of my favorite, but I'll list 3 here because otherwise it kind of moves off. But so, for example, in the 1800s, the Royal Shakespeare Society of America brought across every single bird ever mentioned by Shakespeare and released them in North America, which is why brown sparrow, house sparrows are the most invasive species in America today, right? So like, as a homage to Shakespeare, they just destroyed entire like ecosystems. In 1997, New Zealand farmers deliberately picked up hemorrhagic disease, which is disease that affects rabbits. So rabbits were a problem on their farms, it's an invasive species in New Zealand. The farmers went out, caught rabbits with these diseases in Australia and snuck them back into New Zealand and deliberately released them there. Why? Because they wanted to get rid of the rabbits. People were charged for this, right? Like that's a bad idea if you're just sneaking diseases into another country. But you can see why someone might do that with a gene drive, for example. My favorite of these is a French pathogen researcher who basically, again with rabbits, had a bunch of rabbits in his backyard. And he didn't like the rabbits, they were destroying his crops in his garden. And what he did was he got myxomatosis, which is a disease I talked about earlier that targets rabbits. He basically got some samples of it and it deliberately infected rabbits in his backyard. He figured it was contained because his garden was fenced. And here's the reason that the European rabbit is endangered in its native ranges today in France and the Iberian Peninsula. They estimate he killed off 50% of all rabbits in the area over a year. And 2 years later, rabbit hunters in Belgium reported a 90% drop in catch rates. And then there's a fourth one here that you can't see, which is the other one I really love, which is that when the British reached Australia, they tried to release lions into the outback for hunting purposes. The good news is the Australian outback is not Africa, and they just died immediately from lack of water and inability to hunt kangaroos. But we have like invasive camels and horses, for example, in Australia today, because the British just brought them across because they thought they'd be fun. All right, so humans are not good at this. There are other reasons to think that biocontrol is not a very easy thing to maintain. This is, again, bump graphics weirdly, but there's the added factor that one escape significantly increases the chance of more escapes, right? So if we release a gene drive in rabbits in New Zealand, there's a lower chance of escape to Australia. But once it's in Australia, you really bump its chance of getting to Asia, right? Because you've got more trade and more movement. And once it's in Asia, there's no stopping that thing, right? So every single escape amplifies, basically. Okay, so what I'm saying here is that it's not to say that with the right quarantine in place, you couldn't control a suppression drive and keep it contained. But your chances of doing so are not 100%. And so we really need to be worried about this possible extinction worry.
Have we ever done it?
Done what?
Have successful quarantined intended extinction?
Yes, things like disease use on islands with rabbits, but diseases tend to act very fast. And so you can wipe out a population quickly over a couple of years, and then you don't have to worry about quarantine anymore. We've never done extended ones that I know of. Okay, so given that escape is not insignificant, what are the chances that a gene drive can actually wipe out the entire population of something globally? Okay, so this is still up for debate. We're still modeling a lot of stuff to do with gene drives. There is evidence they may not be as strong as we thought initially. There's some models that suggest that because what you're doing is you're reducing the viability of the offspring, right? You're changing the breeding rates of these species. Even loss of 25%, we have to counteract the drive, right? So like they just might evolve immunity basically. But it's worth noting that any version of the suppression drive which is released will have done everything it can to make sure that it would spread as fast as like hard as possible. Right? That's what it is to release one of these drives, and you want it to be really good at spreading. So unlike the other two risks, where we're working through how to minimize them, you're trying to maximize this risk. Scientists aren't blind to this. They're aware there are issues with this kind of worry. There have been calls to not release suppression drives until we've got counteractive measures on the table. One would be something like daisy chain drives. These are gene drives that delete themselves after a certain number of generations. No one has one of them up and running yet. It doesn't seem like it's going to happen. Like there's a lot of like technical issues with this kind of technology, but it's on the table as a possibility. People talk about the counter drives and all that sort of thing. But when you counter a gene drive within the gene drive, you sort of up your risk factors, right? Like you're just compounding some of your worries. Okay, so there's a possibility that we could figure out a way around this, but like it just doesn't seem like it's viable on the table right now. Okay, so the general gist here is there's no clear way to eliminate this risk, and the better the drives are doing its job, the more likely it is this is going to be a problem. So now we need to figure out when we're allowed to use this technology. So we can make some primitive calculations. I can just run a simple cost-benefit analysis. If the benefits outweigh the costs, like do it, right? The problem is that I have no idea how to evaluate these numbers or these numbers. I don't know what the risk of escape is. I couldn't put a number on it, or even like a vague number on it. I can't tell you the risk of extinction during this escape. I can't tell you the benefits necessarily, right? Like this sort of approach just isn't going to work for this kind of technology. Okay, so it's because of this that we invoke the precautionary principle, right? The precautionary principle says if you don't understand the risks involved, be cautious, don't go forward with the technology. So given the uncertainties and difficulty in knowing how to weigh the risks and benefits, potentially serious repercussions, we shouldn't release a suppression drive, right? The problem is that like, it seems like in some contexts, we should be using suppression drives. Sometimes the invasive species are so bad and doing so much damage, it feels like we are warranted in using this kind of technology to try and solve it. So we need a way to sort of work around the difficulties of not knowing these risks and these factors. So this is where I propose what I think is a good solution, at least the start to a solution. So I'm going to propose a form of dominance argument called the worst case clause. So the worst case clause works roughly like this. If you're warranted in taking an action X, even after assuming that the worst possible outcome will follow, then you're warranted taking action X in general, right? You're worried about not knowing how the risks work and like what numbers to plug in, forget it. I no longer care. Just assume the worst thing. Now I don't have to worry about balancing up things. If it's really bad and it's still better than whatever's currently happening, do it. So in the invasive species case, this means that if we're warranted in releasing what I'm going to call an extinction drive, right, which is a drive you guarantee will wipe the species out. If you're warranted in releasing one of them, you're warranted in releasing a suppression drive, right? So this is where I get to the bit where I tell you about why we're warranted in wiping out all the rabbits globally. Because if we can be justified in driving European rabbits to extinction, then it seems like we're justified in using a gene drive, a suppression drive, on European rabbits to solve the invasive species crisis in New Zealand. All right, so here's a case study in European rabbits. So the European rabbit was introduced in New Zealand in the early 19th century. They've reached plague-like numbers there at various points. They seriously impact both the environment and agriculture. Interestingly, European rabbits are actually the first recorded invasive species by Pliny the Elder. Apparently they're invasive on an island off of Italy back in when Pliny was writing. And the solution back then was for the emperor sent a bunch of soldiers armed with like ferrets to like catch all the rabbits and like bring them off the island, which is kind of what New Zealand did. They released a bunch of weasels and ferrets, the predators off the island, which, surprising no one, immediately started decimating the local bird life. Rabbits are widely invasive, but CRISPR-Cas9 has significant promise now, right? So the question is, are we warranted in releasing a suppression drive to get rid of European rabbits in New Zealand? Well, we apply the worst case clause. We assume that if we release a suppression drive, we will drive European rabbits extinct globally. If that seems better than current status, we should be using suppression drives. Okay. So now we get to the difficult thing of saying, is really wiping out all European rabbits globally better than the current status quo? Well, that's a difficult question, but we have some indicators that we might be able to figure out this answer. So it's difficult to predict, but I've chosen European rabbits for a very good reason, because it turns out there's a bunch of stuff to do with European rabbits in particular that make this like kind of a viable question. So as I've sort of mentioned already, European rabbits are endangered in their home habitat, the Iberian Peninsula and southern France. So in places where the European rabbit is already like under threat, we're seeing significant damages to local Iberian sphinx, or lynx, for example, or the Spanish imperial eagle. Both of those are now under threat because the rabbits are disappearing. So we sort of know a little about what the environment in their native ranges might look like if they disappeared. We can start to track which species would be impacted. Now, it's not just their native ranges. So I took this picture on a hike with Nancy a few years ago. This is the southern parts of England. It turns out, so rabbits are invasive to England and the UK, right, introduced in the 12th and 13th century. But it turns out they may have replaced a megafauna you all once had. And so the heathlands of southern England now rely very heavily on rabbits being there. Myxomatosis got released in New Zealand sort of by accident about 20 years ago. And as the rabbits crashed in this part of the world, so too did a lot of native species. The heathlands basically went through a small environmental crisis until the rabbits are repopulated. Now, those are reasons you might think that the rabbits are important to keep, but rabbits are one of the most invasive species in the world. They're invasive on every continent except Antarctica, including over 800 islands. They threaten or have already wiped out numerous species. And in New Zealand, where we're sort of talking a little bit of case study here, Their existence doesn't just threaten local wildlife by competing, but they support the predators that then go on to eat the birds. Okay, so here's some other quick numbers. This is New South Wales, where I did my undergraduate degree. All of these species are under threat because of rabbit's existence. So these include things like the native barred bilby, the brown-nosed wombat over here, eastern barred wallaby, the malleefowl, and the plains warbler, which is going down here. Right, so all of these are close to extinction with rabbit's existence in New South Wales. This is Laysan Island. It's near Hawaii, and the Laysan millibird, the honey creeper, and the rail possum all went extinct after rabbits were reduced to the island. Okay, so what I'm trying to say is that in most contexts, removing rabbits will be beneficial. Now, it's true that in some contexts it will be bad, right? You might lose the Iberian lynx, you might lose the Spanish imperial eagle, but every benefit or every damage you might see to land ranges are already happening in hundreds of ecosystems throughout the world. The cases where they're doing damage are by basically any measure, much more common than cases where it would do damage to remove them. Okay, so what I'm trying to lead you to here is if we play this simple numbers game, right? The worst case clause says we should release the drive, since wiping out European rabbit globally is better than leaving it in place in a place where it's currently doing damage, right? Just weighing these two things up, it seems like removing them saves more ecosystems than it destroys, saves more species than it destroys. Okay. Couple of notes. This is a very distinct case, right? Again, I picked European rabbits for a reason. They threaten agriculture on a global scale. They threaten species diversity on a global scale. They have a very limited native range, right? Just the southern parts of like the Iberian Peninsula in France. And it is extremely invasive. For those reasons, though, it does seem like for some reason we should be European rabbit. Okay, so this is where people tend to be like, you've made some pretty big assumptions. I've got some worries. I like rabbits, they're great. Please don't kill them all off. And so I'm going to briefly divert through like what I think is like some of the stronger counter arguments to what I just said. The biggest one being whether or not we have a right to cause extinction as a species, right? Here's one where you might have, I've just really biased all this in my favor, right? Why? Well, because I've said the value of a species derives from biodiversity, ecological preservation, stability, whether that's good for humans, right? And invasive species, by definition, are the things that are threatening those, right? And so however you sort of want to value these things, right? By picking the really bad invasive species, I've just made it easy for me to make myself like look good and make something go through. Okay. Here's another argument I have though. What if the species itself is valuable? Right? Instead of thinking in terms of utility and biodiversity and that sort of thing, like maybe rabbits are a valuable thing to have, right? They have a right to exist in ways that mean we shouldn't actively attempt to remove them from the planet. Okay, so I don't love this is like a premise. There have been some really interesting attempts to ground the value of nature and value species in species themselves. Rolson III is a good example of this, and I'm going to go through. But I think it's worth exploring as a way of possibly arguing against what I've sort of presented. Okay, so when people talk to me and they say, look, I really worry about humans deciding to drive a species to extinction, I think what they're saying is something like this, that we have a duty of care principle. We have a duty of care towards any given species, such as we should allow the species to survive. Now, this by itself is not enough to justify keeping rabbits around, because we also have a duty of care towards every species the rabbits trying to drive out or drive to extinction. You need something else here, which I think I can best codify as the active participation principle. So if a species should be allowed to survive, then you should not act such that you knowingly cause the species to go extinct. And given these two, we shouldn't release an extinction drive because it violates our duty of care towards the target species. So the impetus I'm sort of trying to capture is that the idea that we shouldn't act so that we're knowingly destroying species. That somehow seems bad to us. You might really care about the kakapo in New Zealand, but letting the kakapo go extinct is better than actively wiping out the weasels. Okay, so I'm trying to sort of draw out something that's like a little bit like an act to mission distinction here, right? Which is a pretty standard thing in philosophy. But I want to say it's not clear this is a good act to mission distinction to draw. Why? One, we're the ones who introduced the species in the first place. I mean, not you in particular, right? I assume none of you are picking up invasive species and wandering around with them. But like we as a species have been moving these things back and forth. So you might be personally responsible for releasing invasive species, but you benefited from the entire trade, for example, that happens, that moves invasive species around. So to draw an old trope, it's like the trolley problem, right? It's a classic act of mission sort of thing. But imagine that you were the person that released the trolley in the first place, right? Now the distinction between like pulling the lever and not pulling the lever suddenly seems more complicated. Or maybe it's not that you release the trolley, maybe it's just you benefit from the trolley running around the place willy-nilly. And now it seems like you still have skin in the game when it comes to whether or not you pull the lever or not. Okay. This also, I think, is a case where the doctrine of double effect can come in. So the doctrine of effects is the standard formulation of it, right? The action in itself must be good or indifferent. Good effect must be intended. The bad effects will not be intended. The good effect must cause the bad effect. The bad effect cannot be used to achieve the good effect. The good and bad effects must be proportional, such as the good sufficiently outweighs the bad. All right, so the extinction drive, I think, meets all of these criteria. In itself, the release of the gene drive is at worst indifferent, but we intend the good effect of saving the ecosystem. We intend the good effect of saving the ecosystem and the various species within it. We're not intending to drive the species to extinction. The good effect must cause the bad effect, like releasing the suppression drive does cause the extinction of the species globally. And I think, as I talked about earlier, it's proportional. Okay, so three things.
What is the principle? Sorry.
Hmm?
I don't actually know what the doctor is. You just define what a double effect is.
So if you meet all these criteria, you're supposedly warranted taking the action, even if you see foreseeable bad things happen. Okay, so in sum, the choice between passively allowing species to go extinct and actively eliminating is difficult to maintain in the invasive species case due to our broader obligations towards the environment, as well as our passive or direct hand in causing and benefiting from the problem. In the case where we actively release an extinction drive, the global wipeout is an unintended but foreseen consequence of our bid to save the environment, so it meets the requirements of doctrine of double effect, and even though you can't see them on the screen, this argument holds regardless of whether you take the value to be ecosystems, biodiversity, human utility, or the value of the species themselves. Okay, so in conclusion, suppression drives look really good, right? They really can seriously help the environment. There's a reason we're researching these things. But they come with a bunch of sort of hard to define risks that make it really hard to justify releasing them. Because of these risks, the potentially catastrophic effect of them, the Precautionary Principle says we shouldn't use the drives. But I think we can work around this by using what I call the worst case clause, the dominance argument. And the dominance argument isn't going to work in all cases, but some species can be so invasive and so damaging that we seem justified in releasing a suppression drive on them. In particular, things like the European rabbit. But if you look at those, I know, but also things like the ship rat or the black rat, the Caribbean tree frog. There's a couple of species. If you sort of look through the top 100 most invasive species in the world, we can start to pull out which ones seem like they might be viable targets. Now, it's not saying that it meets the worst case clause. You're good, just go for it. There are other factors involved as well we need to worry about, but at least having this in mind gives us a way of starting to work around these worries and starting to justify using these gene drives in real world cases. when we might otherwise sort of be stuck with these worries and risks. Okay, so I'm gonna wrap it up there. And just go for questions.
Let's just hit the stop recording. Do you mind just hitting this?